I want to show you a couple ways to make flying geese units. This is what a flying geese unit looks like. Flying geese units, unless they're an irregular, but traditionally are twice as wide as they are high when they're finished. So this one actually is going to finish at 1 1/4 high when I take my seam off here by 2 1/2. So the first way I'm going to show you is what you'll see lots of times. Simple when you're first starting out. We're going to cut a rectangle that is a 1/2 inch bigger both directions than what we want our finished flying geese unit to be. So remember, this one was 1 1/4 high by 2 1/2. So if we add a 1/2 inch for our seam allowances, a 1/4 inch on each side, then it is 1 3/4 this way, and adding 1/2 inch, 1/4 inch on each side to my 2 1/2 inches makes it 3 inches. So this is a 1 3/4 by 3 inch rectangle. Then we need 2 squares, and the squares are going to be cut the same size as the height of our unfinished flying geese unit. So this is 1 3/4, so these are both 1 3/4 inch squares. On the back of our squares, we are going to mark one diagonal line point to point, and then we're going to take our first square, and put it right sides together with our rectangle. We want one of the points that has the line going into it to be on the bottom of our flying geese unit, bottom corner, and then the other one will go up through the top. We are going to sew. You do not want to sew exactly on the line, but you want to sew inside the seam allowance, so that would be out to this side, just a thread width or so to the side of the line. And the reason you're doing that is that so when you turn this back, it will go all the way to the corner, because thread takes up some space when you are turning your fabric over the top of it. So once I have stitched that, I will turn it back like this and press toward my small triangles in the corner. Once that one is on, then I'm going to, and I pressed it, I'm going to trim away the fabric here. Then I'm going to put the other triangle on. Again, it's going in, the line is going to the bottom corner and then up through the top. And I'm going to sew just to the edge of that line. Again, it's going to flip back. With this method, you are going to trim off your excess, leaving your 1/4 inch seam. So that when it's finished, it looks like this. And that trimming is one of the things I don't like about this method, because you are losing pretty much 2 squares worth of fabric. And even with my employee discount, fabric is still enough that costs enough that I hate wasting it. But if you're just doing one flying geese unit of one style, or you have a really odd measurement, then go ahead and do it this way. I also am not wild about this method, because a lot of times, no matter how careful I am, my square doesn't come out exactly to the edge. And when you're finished, this is your finished size. You're done. The second way I want to show you is making 4 flying geese units at a time. And I'm going to show you using Deb Tucker's or Studio 180, same thing. Wing clipper, you can either use 1 or 2, and the difference between these is the wing clipper 1, the height of your flying geese end at whole numbers like 1 inch and half. So 1, 1 1/2, 2, 2 1/2. And the wing clipper 2 ends at 1/4 and 3/4 heights. So you would need to choose depending on what you're making. I'm going to make these flying geese units the same size as I made the last ones. And remember, my finished size was 1 1/4 high by 2 1/2 wide. So I can come down here on the chart that comes with the ruler, finished size of the flying geese unit, 1 1/4 by 2 1/2. I can always also come over here to what the cut size is. That's the unfinished size of my unit, and it's 1 3/4 by 3 inches, which is exactly the same measurement that we used to cut our rectangle. So this is a little bit different. We're going to come over here, and we need one large square. The large square is going to be the fabric that is the big triangle in our flying geese unit. We just need one of those to make 4 flying geese units. So, and I'm going to come down here, same column, and it says I need a 4-inch large square. And then I'm going to keep going on over, and I need 4 2¼ inch squares, and that's going to be the fabric that's in my background here. So I have already cut those. Here's my large square and my 4 smaller squares. You're going to need to mark your small squares. So you can either mark it like we did the last time with one line going right through the center, or you can use a tool like the magic wand. And with that, it has a scored line, and I'm going to put the scored line on the 2 opposite corners. And this time, rather than just one line, I'm going to mark 2 lines. So the 2 lines are actually lines I'm going to stitch on. If I mark this way, I'll be sewing 1/4 inch from each side, which I will show you what I mean. We're going to take our first 2 small squares, and you're going to mark all your small squares, and we're going to position them right sides together on our big square, going to opposite corners. And then we're going to just nudge those little squares in just a hair. So you're seeing just a little bit of the big square's fabric behind it. And we're doing that because it gives us a little bit more to trim down our finished flying geese unit. And yes, I did say trim down. There's a little tiny bit of waste, but much as I hate to admit it and tried to avoid it for years, you're going to get more perfect units if you can oversize them a little bit and then trim them down. So now I'm going to take this to the sewing machine. And if I marked just one line, I'm going to set my 1/4 inch foot, or wherever my mark is, to get my 1/4 inch on that line, and I'm going to sew 1/4 inch from the line. If I'm not using the single line, I'm going to stitch on the line if I mark 2, and I'm going to do it on both sides, so I'll have 2 rows of stitching. Okay, I've stitched my 2 smaller squares to my large square. And so you see there's the 2 lines of stitching. You're going to have 2 lines no matter which way you marked it. And now I just need to cut this in half between those 2 lines of stitching. You could do it with scissors. You want it to be 1/4 inch, but it doesn't have to be a perfect 1/4 inch seam allowance because it's already sewn. So once I cut it in half, I will take it to my pressing surface, and I'm going to press the small triangles away from the big triangle, so the seam is going to be on the small triangle side. Once I've pressed, I get 2 pieces that look kind of like a heart. So I have 2 more small squares to put on here. Again, I'm going to put it on the big square. I'm going to line up, so my line is going through the center, and this time I'm using the one that has 2 lines drawn. You don't want to bounce back and forth, but I'm just trying to show you both. So it's going on like this. So the line that would be through the center is going through the point in the big square. And I'm going to do that on both of them. And I did bump it in just a little bit from the edge, so I see a little bit of the big square showing from behind there. And again, I will do 2 stitching lines, whether you marked in the center and sew 1/4 inch away from both, or whether you mark the 2 lines and are going to sew on those. Once I've sewn my last 2 squares on both of these units, again I'm going to cut it in half between my stitching lines, and I will press again out toward the small triangle. The wing clipper and the wing clipper 2 rulers are actually trim down rulers. Now I'm looking for my cut size on here, so remember I cut it 3 inches long by 1 3/4 high, so this is going to be the area that I'm using to trim down my flying geese units. So the first thing I'm going to do is there's these little crosshairs here, and you'll be able to tell which one it is because when you put it in the center, you're going to have just a little bit hanging out off the edge all the way around. So I am putting that crosshair there where my seams meet on the top. I'm also checking here and here to make sure these lines are running into my seams, so that I'm keeping everything straight. And when I'm happy with what I'm seeing, I'm going to trim off one edge and the top. And I really need to change my rotary cutter blade. Shouldn't be that difficult. Okay. So once I've trimmed that off, those two sides are ready to go. And I'm going to then turn the unit. Let me move this a little bit. I'm running into the edge of my mat. And now my 3-inch mark and my 1 3/4 inch mark should be on the two edges I just cut. And you'll notice there are also diagonal lines on this trim down tool here, and then there are ones right next to each other. So those diagonal lines are going to sit on top of my seam. So my 1 3/4 mark is here, my 3-inch mark is here. I have those diagonal lines running right along that seam, and I'm going to trim. And there I have a pretty much perfect Flying Geese unit. Let me do one more. I'm going to line up that crosshair, and you'll know which one again because there's just a little bit all the way around on your sides. So the crosshair goes right there where the seams meet in the top. I'm checking to make sure that as much as possible my lines here are also running into my seams so that it all stays straight. I'm going to trim, and then I'm going to turn my unit. And this time my mark for my cut size, here it is, 3 and 1 3/4 on this one, are running along the edges I just cut. And I also want my diagonal lines to be on my seams. And cut. And I just want to show you, this is all the waste there is with that method versus 2 times this. So this takes a lot less fabric to make your Flying Geese units. The one thing that it does do is it makes 4 units that are all exactly the same, and sometimes you may not want that, but most of the time I do.